Hello and welcome. This is History of Art from the Renaissance. I'm Travis Lee Clark. I'm a lecturer at Utah Valley University, and this is my second half of survey course. If you took the first half of survey course, this one covers everything after that. Let me just introduce you. A little bit about myself. I got my PhD at Temple University, where I was working on mostly medieval topics, working on manuscripts. I did my dissertation research at St. Catherine's Monastery. This is St. Catherine's Monastery that you can see here. Here is me posing as Indiana Jones in front of it. I stayed up in a little apartment over there on the right-hand side, and I worked on manuscripts like this. St. Catherine's Monastery is in the middle of an abject desert. The joke about it is that this is where Moses saw the burning bush, but the miracle is that he saw a bush at all, because it is just desolate. It makes Utah look like the Cambodian rainforest by comparison. But that's very, very good for manuscripts. It's a beautiful place for manuscripts to be preserved, and so I got to take a look at this one, the Christian topography, which is a fun one. After graduating, though, I actually spent a lot of my time doing research on Islamic topics. That was one of my other areas that I worked on, and they have beautiful manuscripts too, including this one. This one comes from Safavid Persia. It's just this beautiful, luscious manuscript. This tells the story of Geomars, who is the first man in Persian tradition, in the Shahnameh, the great epic of Persian society. But I also did some research in Indian art. Kurt Barrett was a professor at Temple University, and I was there. He's currently a curator, assistant curator of the Asian collections at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he was working on items such as these wonderful Buddhas from Gandhara. So I ended up having a lot of non-Western experience for someone who started out as a medievalist. Eventually, I graduated and had to go get this thing we call a job. And the first place that I went to interview at was a small little state school in far west Texas, and they asked the wrong question in the interview. They should have asked, have you taught Latin American art? Instead they asked, could you teach Latin American art? And I said, why, yes, I can. Unfortunately, I didn't know a thing about Latin American art. Not anything. Zip bupkis. But I had a few months, so I dived into the library, and I discovered, hey, there's lots of cool stuff over there, too. And so I became a huge fan of Latin American art. They have fabulous manuscripts, such as these, as the Florentine Codex. These are what I call Mexica Revival manuscripts that, after the conquistadors destroyed Mexica Aztec civilization, a lot of that culture was lost. But in 1542, the laws changed, and suddenly people were allowed to rediscover their own culture. And so there were all of these books that were produced to kind of recover their native culture. I love this one. This one comes from the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca, and what you see here is these are the 7 caves, and these 7 caves are the caves where the Mexica tribe came out on their wanderings. So this shows the migrations of the Aztec, and I love how it shows their little footprints. It's really fun. So I taught Latin American art for a few years there, and one of the other things that Sul Ross, Texas is known for is that it's not far from the Chinati Foundation. The Chinati Foundation is in Marfa, Texas. Marfa, Texas was the place where Donald Judd, this very famous modern artist, came and set up a foundation. He took over an old Army air base and turned it into a place where artists could do large-scale installations. This is one of his large-scale installations, 15 untitled works in concrete. Some of the locals, I'm sure, believe this is an abandoned irrigation project of some kind, but no, this is a work of art, and it's actually quite spectacular. So I actually taught a lot of contemporary art, and that's where my focus has been since then. I've taught mostly non-Western topics and contemporary art since then. So if you take my non-Western class, and you really should, it's a fun class, the first thing that we do is we start talking about what an absurd thing it is to have a non-Western class, to define something by what it is not instead of what it is. And it's kind of a little bit insulting. So my first lecture in my non-Western class is deconstructing the idea of non-Western. But it occurred to me a couple of years back that this was actually a very useful thing to do for Western art. That when we think about Western art, what do we mean when we say something is Western? Non-Western is obviously an arbitrary term, but Western is no less arbitrary. So what do we mean by Western art? Well, we certainly don't mean things like art of cowboys and Indians in the American West, although I'm a huge fan of Charles Russell and Frederick Remington. What we mean are the arts of Western civilization, which generally mean the arts of the Mediterranean, the Near East, and Europe from the prehistoric period up to the Greco-Roman period, and then again the arts of Europe and Mediterranean from the end of the Greco-Roman period up to the early modern period. And then moving beyond into the modern period, arts of Europe and its colonies from the early modern period to the contemporary period. So if you took my 2710 course, we covered everything from prehistoric up through medieval, but this class is going to cover this section, this 500-year period where we go from the greatness of Michelangelo to the incredible abstraction of Willem de Kooning. And that's quite a story to tell. Now, just right off the bat, you should recognize there's an inherent imbalance in this. So if you look at the first class 2710, History of Art to the Renaissance, covers 35,000 years. And the second class covers just 500 years. So that 35,000 year time period, just to give you a sense of scale, is really enormous. It's nearly 70 times as long as the period from the Renaissance to today and our greatest cultural achievement, Cardi B. And you may wonder, why then is the class so disproportionate? Why do we spend so much time on just this last 500 years? Why is this considered worthy of half of a class as opposed to the other period, which covers 35,000 years? It's quite a question. And the truth is, the reason why is because the Renaissance is a major turning point for Western civilization. It is the point where the canon for Western art gets defined. It is where we define the idea of what the West is. It's pretty much the time when the West becomes the West. And so great things like Michelangelo's David, the Sistine Chapel, for example, are the benchmark for Western art. And that's true going back in past too, that for centuries we judged the art of the past in light of the Renaissance. I mean, like I like to tell people, Renaissance means a rebirth. Well, you can't have a rebirth without a death. And if you think about that, that's kind of a slam on the Middle Ages and everything that came before. Ooh, you're dead. We had to be reborn. That's not exactly a nice imagery if you think about it. And we think, oh, it's a rebirth. You know, yeah, it's good for the person's rebirth, but it says everything came before was death. And that's not true. The Middle Ages were a wonderful time period and certainly didn't see themselves in need of being reborn. But that's how we perceived it. And so the Western canon is really quite unusual. The Western canon represents this idea of what Western art is. Now, a canon, you may or may not know, is a system or a set of governing rules about art. Or you could think of it as a set of accepted or authoritative images of art. That is, these are the images that define what Western art is. You could think of this as official or accepted versus unofficial. And the Western canon is, in fact, quite huge. We have pulled a lot of things into it, including a lot of stuff that maybe doesn't belong in it, like Egyptian art, why Egyptian art and how Egyptian art, which is culturally, ethnically, and historically distinct from us, manages to get into the Western canon is a heck of a story. But I'll save that story for if you haven't taken the 2710 course. You can go over and take a look at those videos. But it's considered to be part of the Western canon. Certainly things like Michelangelo are considered to be part of the Western canon. And certainly things made in the West in the last 100 years are considered part of the canon. Anything outside of that, regardless of its merit, whether it's African art, Japanese art, Asian art, Sub-Saharan Africa art, Latin American art, pre-Columbian art, all of that is not considered part of the Western canon. Now, I did this for my 2710 course, but I just think it's really good to do it, is that sometimes it's really hard to understand what we mean by a canon. How is it that we decided that these works of art are in the club and some works of art are not in the club? And I realized that I really don't have to explain it to you, because now we live in a time where everybody knows what canon means. Now, when I was started teaching 20 years ago, canon was something only spoken of by art historians and geeks. But we live in the golden age of geekdom. Oh yes, now is at our time. All the movies, all the biggest franchises are all geek franchises. So let me explain it through geek. Let's talk about Harry Potter. So Harry Potter, the canon is defined by official movies and books, things that J.K. Rowling has decided are part of the official canon. So these things are canon. That is, that they're official, they're recognized. They have the mark of authority from J.K. Rowling and the creators themselves. Some things that are not canon would be your favorite fan fiction, your ships, or anything else that you might consider. That is definitely not canon. Now, I'm a Harry Potter fan, but I'm an even bigger Star Wars fan. So I'm actually going to skip to another universe to explain this. One of the things that's really interesting about canon is that it is not set in stone. It changes. Many of you probably recognize this character. This is Daisy Ridley, of course, playing Rey from Force Awakens and the new Star Wars trilogy. And she is definitely regarded as part of the canon. But many of you probably don't recognize this character over here on the right. This is actually Mara Jade. Mara Jade was once upon a time part of the canon, but today is not part of the canon. She was part of the Star Wars canon, but she was removed. But who knows, maybe someday in the future, I hope, she'll come back to be part of the canon. And now you're even beginning to hear rumors. Oh my gosh, have you heard about this? There are rumors that they're going to reboot the entire Star Wars trilogy, and they may erase the Star Wars trilogy and reboot it using some Force time magic, which would be awful, because that would mean that Daisy Ridley's character Rey would cease to be canon. So no one's position is safe. So how did we get to this place? How did we get to this place where canon is so flexible and yet it seems so official? Well, let me take you back. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was this thing called the expanded universe. Before the revitalization of Disney in the 90s, you had, of course, the original trilogy, Star Wars: A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. And then you also had a few Ewok movies, which I will defend to the death. I think those movies are better than everybody thinks. Hey, Wilford Brimley was in one of those movies. Always a good call. But there was also a wide array of comic books, novels, tie-in products. This was the expanded universe, and it was awesome. The whole thing was awesome. If you've never read Splinter of a Mind's Eye, you really need to. It makes no sense with the rest of the universe. I don't know how it fits in, but it was fabulous, written by Alan Dean Foster. But it's a great novel. And everything in this universe was regarded as canon. And they introduced a lot of characters that weren't in the original movies, including Mara Jade, who became eventually the wife of Luke Skywalker, and Admiral Thrawn was first introduced this. And everybody in this universe was canon. Everything was canon. But then came the dark times. And we had the sale of Lucasfilm to Disney. And suddenly everything changed. Disney had no interest in maintaining the extended universe. What they wanted to do was to make new movies and make new dollars from those movies. And it was just too hard to deal with the expanded universe. So they just got rid of it. They absolutely axed Mara Jade and Thrawn and got rid of them. And they started on a whole new universe. And of course, they introduced Finn and Rey. And with Finn and Rey, a whole new line of toys and merchandise. Well, this did not please the fans. I mean, fans were happy to have new movies, of course, but we were not happy about the loss of the expanded universe. It was like a great cry went out and was suddenly silenced. So Disney wants to make money more than anything else. So of course they invented this thing called Star Wars Legends. Star Wars Legends was quasi-canon. Basically, it was all the old stories of the Star Wars expanded universe, and they were brought back so that they could continue to sell them and make money, but they weren't quite canon. They were kind of half canon, but they brought back Thrawn, and in fact, Thrawn has made a big resurgence. He's now fully canon again. He's been introduced into the television show Rebels and a bunch of other things, so Thrawn has been restored. But Mara Jade has not been restored. You hear rumors that they're going to bring Mara Jade back, but I don't think it'll ever happen. So this leaves us as a question is, how does the canon decided and who decides it? And in the case of Star Wars, well, actually it's a complicated issue. You do have these legal entities, Lucasfilm and Disney. They own it. They get to make the call. But interestingly enough, they're not the only ones who get to call. You have popular experts, bloggers, media critics, like Adam Sadovich, for example. These people have a lot of reputation that comes along. And then you have fans. You have tradition. If the fans get upset, there goes your money base, and you can't really ignore the cash cow for that long. So you got to make the fans happy. You got to do some fan service. So all three of these come together to influence what the canon is. Legally, Disney, Lucasfilm get to make the final say, but they definitely listen to popular critics, bloggers, tradition fans. Just look at the way fans have absolutely embraced The Mandalorian, for example. And that's like, oh yeah, fine, we'll give them some more of that. That's how it's going to work. So let's talk about the Western Canon of Art. Who decides what the Western Canon of Art is? It's actually pretty similar. You have authorities, legal entities. These are museums and institutions, academies, museums, etc. If a museum just chooses not to collect someone, then that person isn't going to be seen 10, 20, 50 years down the line, and then people will forget about them. So they have a big impact. If they choose to collect a particular artist, that artist is going to get into the collection. And they can change people's opinions by that means. It's amazing how much authority and power these institutions have. Of course, there are popular experts. That would include people like moi, art historians, curators, enthusiasts, who make a case for certain artists to be included, certain artists not to be included. It's kind of interesting that certain artists disappeared, but were later revived. Frida Kahlo, for example, was in the circle of Diego Rivera and the other Mexican muralists at the time. Her house was the center of these radicals and bohemians and artists and literary figures that would come together. I mean, Trotsky lived in her house for a while. It's kind of amazing. But she actually got forgotten after she died. She got forgotten for about 20, 30 years there until a bunch of art historians saying, hey, wait a minute. She was there. She was playing with the big boys. She was holding her own and producing really serious work. She deserves to be revitalized. So she gets revitalized. So she comes back. So art historians can play an important part. So if there's some, media critic or fanboy out there who's really excited and really wants to make a case for who is the best doctor, by the way, it's Matt Smith. But if they wanted to make the case that, say, John Pertwee was the best doctor, they could bring some of that back and bring a new appreciation. And of course, then there's just kind of tradition. What we might think of as popular consensus. At the end of the day, there's this old story about a marketing firm that made this dog food, and they were going to spend millions marketing it. And at the end of the day, the dog food was terrible and the dogs didn't eat it. And it didn't matter how much you marketed it. If the dogs don't eat the dog food, it's not going to go. And so if these museums, these popular experts put up exhibitions that nobody goes to look at, then that's a problem. Ultimately, museums have to pay the bills just like anybody else. And if people aren't buying it, well, that's not there. I mean, you can see this in museums, that museums will deliberately have exhibitions that will attract ticket payers and people who will buy tickets and support and donate to the museum. So there is a kind of popular consensus, a vox populi, a feedback. I think it's really interesting. So you have very important and prominent art historians such as Vasari, Winckelmann, and Meyer Shapiro, and it's kind of funny to think of these people as fanboys who make their case for one work of art over another, or one artist over another, but that's really the case. And much as I talked about Frida Kahlo falling in and out of favor, there's some pretty impressive works of art that have fallen in and out of favor. This, believe it or not, was once one of the most famous works of art in Western art. Winckelmann called it the epitome of grace, noble simplicity, and quiet grandeur. And people would flock to go see this statue. It was more famous than Michelangelo's David, and it was considered to be part of the canon. But tastes changed. Tastes changed dramatically as you got into the 19th century, till the very famous 19th century critic John Ruskin called it positively bad. And so suddenly it's out of the canon. Kenneth Clark, art historian who did that wonderful series Civilization, had this wonderful quote. He said, "For 400 years after it was discovered, the Apollo was the most admired piece of sculpture in the world. It was Napoleon's greatest boast to have looted it from the Vatican. Now it is completely forgotten except by the guides of coach parties who have become the only surviving transmitters of traditional culture." And so you'll see this change happen to works of arts. As an art historian, or as the public has interest in it, it will wax and wane. 300 years ago, the Mona Lisa was not regarded as a particularly good example by Leonardo. In fact, it was seen as kind of a minor, unfinished work. But of course, now it's one of the most famous works of art in the world. So the canon of Western art changes. So how are we to define what Western art is? Well, the truth is, while we have these broad areas of description, what we really mean by Western art is art that appeals to Western senses of identity. Particularly for this class, we're going to talk about this period of the early modern period, from the Renaissance forward. Why? Because this is the period where the West truly becomes the West. Not to offend anybody out there, but Western civilization wasn't all that for most of its history. If you were to go to a far-flung part of the world, say before the year 1500, and you would ask some of the most sophisticated cultures in the world what they thought of Europe, the answer would be not much. And that was the truth. The first gunpowder empires were Muslims. They were the Ottomans and the Mughals. They were these vast, powerful navies. The Ming Dynasty in China was this incredible economic powerhouse. Of course, the cultures of the New World, the Inca and the Aztec, hadn't even heard of Westerners and probably wish they never did. And Europe was considered a cultural backwater. Economically, it had no luxury goods, no skilled services or products to produce, and it produced, in the eyes of other cultures, no great work of art. One of my favorite quotes is by Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta was this Islamic explorer and scholar, and he travels the world. He goes all the way to India and China, and then he eventually gets back home, and he was living in North Africa, and his emir says, well, now you have to go to West Africa because you were the only person that has traveled the whole world, and you need to see the entire world. And Ibn Battuta says, well, what about Europe? And then he and the emir look at each other silently and then burst out laughing because it was a joke, because nobody thought Europe was worth seeing. Yeah, Europe really wasn't up to much economically, politically, militarily. We focus a lot on Europe, but up until about the 15th, 16th century, it wasn't really much going on. And then something happened, and it was all triggered by trade. And here I'm going to have to explain a little bit. I hate having a single slide where I just talk for a long period of time, but it's really the only way I can do it. So let's talk about it. Europe didn't have squat. It didn't have much in the way of luxury goods. Europe, of course, was located here. But in the Middle East here, and in India, and in Asia, they had lots of goods. And in fact, down even here in West Africa and the gold and ivory coast. Africa had salt, gold, ivory, enormous raw goods and that were very valuable. In the Middle East, they had frankincense and myrrh and lots of valuable resins. India was loaded up with gems. Ceylon, that is modern-day Sri Lanka, it's just a treasure trove of gems. It's astonishing how many sapphires and rubies come out of that island. And of course, India had silk and spices. Now, the thing about almost all of these goods is that they're expensive, high-end luxury goods, and they're also consumables. So you ship silk via the Silk Road, which is this long road that traveled all the way up into Europe. If you traveled and you made silk and you took it to the Europe, they could use the silk for a while, but then eventually the silk would wear out. So that means you would send gold to the East to buy silk, and the silk would come back, but the silk would wear out, and then you'd have to send more gold. And so this was a huge trade imbalance. And of course, the people in the middle, particularly Muslims living in this section of the world, were getting rich both ways because they were buying silk at the lowest prices and selling it at the highest prices, and getting raw goods from Europe and then selling them on to Asia at high prices. Asia had enormous amounts of luxury goods that were consumable goods, and so there was this never-ending demand. So Europe was in a pickle. Europe didn't have much of anything to trade. It did have iron, and it did have wool, and it did have wood. It had really kind of basic stuff. And it also had guns. It was developing guns really well. But other than that, they didn't have a lot to trade, and they were actually devaluing their own money to an incredible degree because so much silver and gold had been shipped east and south and elsewhere. And you can actually find Roman coins and medieval coins put into jewelry in places as far-flung as Japan and India. It's really quite amazing how much gold actually went that direction. But the Europeans had an incredible thirst for luxury goods. They loved silk, they loved pepper, they loved all of these high-end luxury goods, and they wanted more of them. But they decided to cut out the middleman, and they did something that no one else had ever really done before. That is, they started building ships, and they built deep-hulled ships that could sail on the open ocean, and they developed techniques for navigating those ships across the ocean. And of course, this led to the great age of discovery. This incredible age of discovery, where first Portuguese managed to circumnavigate all of Africa and go to India, and then eventually to the East Indies and Japan. Spain was pretty much cut off from that route, so Spain decided to go the other direction, and of course you've heard the story about Columbus. Columbus in 1492, and of course the myth that everybody thought the world was flat that's just BS, you know. Everybody knew the world was round. The question was, how big around was it? So the Spaniards thought that they could get to all of this wealthy trade over here by sailing around the world, and wouldn't you know it, they happened to luck right into a complete other hemisphere with two massive continents and rich islands and whole new cultures to exploit. And so this began a period of Western domination, rapidly growing Western domination. And we really can't overstress this enough. Not only did we have the conquest of whole cultures, such as the Inca and the Aztecs by the conquistadors, we had global trade on a level we had never seen before. In the 16th and 17th centuries, China, the Ming Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, these were some of the biggest empires that the world had ever seen, some of the most powerful empires. But their ships never went much more than a few hundred miles beyond their home ports. They would instead go to a port and trade at that port and come back. China certainly had the ability to navigate the oceans. They had deep-hulled ships. They had really amazing treasure vessels. But for whatever reason, the emperor decided to call back the treasure vessels, and so they did not have this era of exploration. And the impact is profound. What it means is that Europeans start popping up all over the world. There were European ships in Nagasaki. There were European ships in Indonesia. There were European ships in ports of Africa. And you can see the impact of this. This is a wonderful little painting. This comes from a style of painting known as Nanban art in Japan. And this is barbarian art. And this is art that focuses on barbarians. And so these are Portuguese traders trading in Japan. You can see that they're wearing clothes that don't look Japanese. They have these ruffs on their necks, which I'm sure the Japanese thought looked ridiculous. Over here is a similar scene, but this one comes from Africa. This one comes from modern-day Nigeria. This is a Benin culture, and this shows a Portuguese soldier with a gun. And notice that he also is wearing kind of a ruff around his neck and a whole variety of things. So in addition to confirming the fact that Westerners dressed funny and looked funny, this is proof that something was changing, that Westerners were showing up in Eastern and in Southern ports, but those cultures, as rich and as fantastic as they were not sending traders to, say, Portsmouth or to, Copenhagen. There were no Chinese vessels making ports in, England or anywhere else, but there were plenty of English vessels making ports in China. In fact, that's why Hong Kong was once upon a time a colony of the British Empire. That's why Macau was a colony of Portugal, because you had these European powers expanding trade. And all because we got tired of paying the high-end prices. We wanted to cut out the middlemen and go directly to the source. So this begins the era of Western globalism. This 500-year period is really quite an amazing period. And it's important to know how short this is in terms of civilization. That the civilization, Muslim civilization, 1,300 years old. Chinese civilization is, good gravy, 3,000 years old. And this period that we think of as the West, this period of dominance, is really a very short time frame, mostly from the 16th century onward. And it's still continuing today. The Western powers, the Western nations, are the most developed nations. They have the highest standard of living. Of course, it's important to know that they did that by large means by extracting an enormous amount of wealth from the colonies that they laid hands on. The colonial imperial period, of course, was a very ugly period from the 18th up through the 20th century. We're still, some colonies are still there. Other colonies, only really gained their independence in the 1960s. So we're not that far from it. And even today, even though we're kind of past the imperial and the colonial period, it's easy to see the dominance of Western culture everywhere you go. Before we did it with, kind of colonization. Now we do it through the global marketplace. Western brands, Western clothing are found everywhere in the world. And the same cannot be said in reverse. And you can see this impact. Japan is one of those amazing examples of this. Japan had a very strong military. Of course, this was the era of the shogun and the samurai. And they had pushed off 2 invasions by the Mongols, as well as numerous other invasions. So there's your Ghost of, was it Tsushima? There's your Ghost of Tsushima reference. I haven't played it, so no spoilers, please. But yeah, that's basically about the Japanese pushing off the Mongols. And so they had a very strong and proud tradition of, basically keeping foreigners at bay. But then a terrible incident happened in the middle of the 19th century. Commodore Perry, an American, was barred from trading in Japan. Japanese said, if you want to trade, you have to trade through the Portuguese and the Dutch that we've made treaties with. And if you want to trade with Japan, you got to trade through them. And America didn't like that. America wanted to trade directly with Japan. So America did what America does. We sent our gunships and said, yeah, we think you should open up your ports and trade with us. The Japanese weren't intimidated. They had cannons, they had firearms. But when Commodore Perry began shelling Tokyo Harbor, suddenly the Japanese realized that his cannons were so powerful that their cannons couldn't even reach his ship. That the American cannons could shoot from so far away that they couldn't even reach them with their artillery. And it stunned the Japanese. They didn't realize that they had slipped behind so far militarily. And so you see a rapid transformation of Japanese society in the 19th century. Japanese decide, no way are we going to be taken over by these foreigners. But the way they decided to do it was to embrace foreign ideas. In Europe, England had industrialized, America had industrialized, but Germany was still mostly rural towards the end of the 19th century, and Japan was practically the third nation in the world to industrialize. That's how, quickly they adapted. And you can see the transformation in clothing, that you instantly start seeing Japanese people wearing Western dress. And of course, if you go to Japan today, most Japanese people wear a Western dress. Western dress has become the kind of standard of dress in the world. Blue jeans are universal. Baseball caps are universal. Of course, this rapid industrialization of Japan set it on a trajectory that ultimately led to the Pearl Harbor in World War II, and ultimately the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's kind of ironic that Nagasaki, which was the center of Western influence in Japan, became one of the targets of the most dire form of Western influence, the atomic bomb. So this shows how even when a country isn't directly conquered, you have these huge cultural shifts because of the rise of the West. And so this time period of the West and its arrival is really critical. So if you remember my last class, or if you took the last class, 2710 is all about explaining how from ancient times up to the Renaissance, we have this thing we call Western. But now we have an equally challenging problem, which is how to explain how we get from the Renaissance to the modern period. We have as dramatic a reversal in Western art as we did in the first half with development of Classicism. And so how does this happen? So how is it that both of these very different objects are part of the Western tradition? Well, to get to that, we have to talk a little bit about visual culture. You may have had this if this was my 2710 course, but let's just do it again. Remember that there is a material culture, which is the sum total of a culture's physical production, its utilitarian objects, its manufactured objects, etc. And then there's the visual culture, which is the sum total of how a culture visualizes itself. Art is one of these strange objects that occupies the overlap of this Venn diagram. A work of art generally doesn't have any utilitarian function. It exists to represent an image, but it's a physical object. So it's a physical object that represents the visual culture. You can think of this likewise as visual culture being ideas or concepts of how you view yourself, and objects being the manifestation of those ideas. So I usually explain this through my wonderful chair analogy. So if you take a look at chairs, a chair just has to function. That's all it has to do. All it's got to do is keep your bottom from hitting the floor, and it functions. Anything will do that. Simple block of wood will do that. But very clearly, chairs are not just blocks of wood. They actually take on something of the character of the people who sit in them. And here's a prime example. Over on the left, we have a Shaker chair. The Shakers were a religious group in the United States, and they believed that everything should have a purpose. All art, all creation should be utilitarian, functional, clean, and they created a whole style of art that was very simple, but also very beautiful and very elegant. And Shaker furniture, particularly antique, original Shaker furniture, is highly sought after today for its sturdiness, its craftsmanship. But you'll notice that it's very simple, but it says something about their culture. Even if we don't know anything about the Shakers other than this chair, we can look at this chair and say this is a no-nonsense culture that values simplicity and elegance and craftsmanship. The chair on the other side, of course, is a throne. And a throne, again, is just something to keep your bottom from hitting the floor, but it's far more ornate. This doesn't just say, hey, I'm a chair, I'm functional. This chair is far beyond functionality. This chair says, I am an emperor. I am something important, and you should pay attention to me. That's what the purpose of a throne is. And of course, between these two extremes, you have something in between, like a Chippendale chair. A Chippendale chair would be a chair that has some level of elegance, but at the same time, it's not as austere as the Shaker chair, but it's not as overwrought as, say, the throne. That's what visual culture is. So when we talk about visual culture versus art history is a very kind of exclusive view. It's like what we put in our museums. It's those things we decide to put in our museums. Visual culture is a lot more broadly based. It's a much more inclusive way of thinking about art. And it includes things like mass-produced objects, and it recognizes there's a kind of subjective basis for art, that there isn't really an objective basis for art. This is the stuff that represents us. And I think this is a perfect way of thinking, particularly as we go into the modern period. The tomato soup can by Campbell's is an object of visual culture, and it became such an iconic feature of visual culture that it just made sense for Andy Warhol to elevate it to the level of art. You couldn't have Andy Warhol's soup cans without Campbell's original soup cans. One is a reflection of the other. And I love pop art for that reason, because it's a commentary on visual culture and the visual culture of the modern age, which is dominated by consumer goods, by products of this nature. So what is the visual culture of Western art? Well, the visual culture of Western art, or how European derived people see themselves, is based in many ways. It's based on stylistic ideals, naturalism, monumentality. It's also based on kind of historical or contextual ideas, classicism, Christianity, humanism, progression, and of course for this class, modernism. We're going to look at a few of these. We're going to look at classicism and Christianity, but we're also going to look at humanism, this idea of progression in society, and also modernism. Modernism is a big one. So let's talk about classicism briefly. So classicism refers to the cultures of Greece and Rome. If I say something is a classic, what do I mean by that? I mean, it's a standard, it's a benchmark, everybody recognizes it. Classic rock, okay, we're talking about Queen. Classic cars, we're talking about a 57 Chevy Bel Air, or something of that nature. Something that everybody recognizes. And so the first classics were, of course, the Greeks and the Romans. They set the standards for monumentality, for naturalism in art, for classical orders. And not surprisingly, when the Renaissance comes around, the Renaissance picks back up on this classicism. And so the story of classicism in Western visual culture is largely the story of this arrival, survival, and revival of classicism, and of course in the modern tradition about the abandonment of classicism. So you have classicism arriving with the Greeks, you have it kind of being preserved through the Middle Ages, and then you have it kind of being revived in the Renaissance. But then by the time we get to the 19th and 20th century, classicism dies out. People turn their back on classicism and naturalism and go a different way. And that's a major story. Why do they go that way? So, of course, when we talk about classicism, and particularly when we talk about the Renaissance, we're going to end up talking a lot about this guy, Giorgio Vasari, who's often regarded as the father of art history. He's the guy who coins the term of the Renaissance. Rinascita. He's the person who creates the term. And of course, what he meant by that is that people like Michelangelo were looking back to the classical nudes of the ancient world, of the Greeks and Romans, and were fusing them into the Christian tradition. Christianity then becomes a major part of the European experience and Western visual culture, because Christianity comes... I always forget I have that sound effect in there. So Christianity becomes the dominant religion of Europe. And of course, this leads to the Crusades and a whole bunch of other unpleasantness. But much of the medieval art of the world is preserved and created by Christians, and at various times they either reject it, but they're also the people who preserve the classical tradition. And so, whether it's something like the tombs of the catacombs of Rome or the cathedrals of Europe, these owe their inspiration and their creation to Christianity. But beginning in the 13th and moving and accelerating up through the 16th century, we have something else. We have a new idea, and the new idea is humanism. And the humanism is really an outgrowth of what we might call medieval scholasticism. We always think of the Middle Ages as backward. That's not true. Well, you're technically not now in a university. I'm in my basement, and I don't know where you're at, but you may be in your bedroom or wherever. But once upon a time, children, people would actually gather together in groups larger than 10. It was a wonderful time. They would go and see movies and sporting events, and they would actually attend classrooms in places called universities. I gotta stop. This is making me sad. Crap. Gosh, I hope this thing gets over. I can't wait to get back to classrooms. Okay. But once upon a time, not that long ago, we actually used to meet in large classrooms together in places called universities. Universities are, of course, the invention of the Middle Ages. People don't think about this, but a university, the name university is like a unity of all universal knowledge. That's what the name university kind of means. And it was a place where you could come together to learn from scholars and learn knowledge. And they revived all of these classical traditions. So the return of classical traditions actually begins in the Middle Ages. And you have authors like Dante, Petrarch, Erasmus, who are major influence on revitalizing this classical knowledge. And together this creates a new philosophy called humanism, where the emphasis of the philosophy is on human reason and free will. It's this belief that the way to understand the universe is by reason, and you can use human intellect and reason to understand the universe around you by observation. And so therefore, you should have a preference for humans in your philosophy. You should have this preference for a human-driven philosophy, and that humans should be regarded as kind of this high point of philosophy, that humans themselves, their basic humanity, guaranteed their inherent worth, and that you should not impede their free will or their reason. We tend to think of humanism as an atheistic movement today because we think of secular humanism, but humanism was a Christian view in the 15th and 16th century. It was the view that God made the universe as an ordered place. He made men a little bit lower than the angels so that they could understand it, and so he certainly expected them to use their reason and their free will to understand the world and to make it a better place. One of the great things that comes out of this is this idea of progression, that the universe is governed by change, and this change can be moved in a positive direction. And this change has enormous impacts on both art and science. You and I live in an era that everybody just accepts the concept of progress. We just assume that the cell phones, the iPhones this year are going to be better than the iPhones from last year. We assume that technology is going to advance. We assume that society is going to advance, that we're going to get less racist, more progressive, that we're going to be better in the future. It doesn't mean that you don't have to exercise, your agency and your will and your action to do that, but we assume that the world is a world of linear progress. This is a very modern idea. This is not the idea of the Middle Ages or even of the ancient world. The ancient world was very much a cyclical world. This is the wheel of fortune, the wheel of fate as determined. And of course, a wheel turns. And that means that sometimes you're on top, and sometimes you're on top like here, and sometimes you're desperately clinging on. Here we were in 2019. Here we are now in 2020, just desperately clinging on. But, we'll be pulled up to the top again. And it was seen as cyclical, that the universe was seen as essentially static and cyclical, that it didn't have this progress or change. but beginning with these humanist ideas, this idea that you could change. So you have a revolution in the arts, because of course, if you believe in change, the art should therefore progress as well. You have the scientific revolution, you have the arrival of Copernicus and Galileo in the 17th century, who of course bring us the heliocentric universe, and also this advance in science. Ultimately, this leads us to a very tumultuous age that we call the Enlightenment, the 18th and early 19th century, where we see an abrupt progress in science and technology, but also in society. And you can see that summed up in some pretty amazing works of art. I love this work of art by Joseph Wright. And what we see is this wonderful experiment. Here you have this kind of mad-haired scientist, and he is putting a dove into a vacuum pump. And this is to prove that air has substance. This was cutting-edge science at the time. And so the bird is dying from the lack of oxygen. The boy over here is lifting the cage back up because he knows they're not going to need it because the bird is going to die. What I love is everybody is illuminated from the light coming from this direction. But the light here is the light of science. It's not a spiritual light. It's the light of science. And then you have this little kind of wonderful dramatic scene where the daughters are just traumatized. This bird is going to die. And the father, being a typical dad, is saying, no, see, it's educational. So it's fun. So it's a wonderful example. It's a wonderful kind of example of how ideas were changing in the direction towards the use of science and the use of reason. This, of course, spills out over into politics as well. That the era of the 18th and 19th century was an era noted for revolution and social change. You may have heard of a little thing called the American Revolution in 1776. It was certainly part of this. You also have the French Revolution, which kind of ended badly and resulted in many more revolutions. This is the Revolution of 1830 being recorded here. And so we have a classical figure here representing liberty. She's this kind of half, draped, semi-nude classical figure, but she carries a musket. And so you have this wonderful kind of mix of modern and contemporary people with contemporary weapons and contemporary dress from all classes of society, but very much coming together. And this period of rapid change ultimately results in the Industrial Revolution. You have two industrial revolutions. The first is kind of the advent of textile technology and mills that starts happening after about 1720. And the second industrial revolution in the 19th century, you have this huge explosion. Eventually you have the arrival of fossil fuels, coal and oil, which begin to fuel these things, and it absolutely changes the landscape. You have Wordsworth talking about the poet, these dark satanic mills that dotted the landscape. But it created a whole level of material culture that we didn't have before, and a whole level of material wealth that people didn't have before. Yes, people worked in these absolute sweatshop conditions in these textile mills, but that meant that people could have nice textiles. And this really just changed society. Instead of a society of farmers and craftsmen and kind of elites at the top, we now had a society of workers and factory workers. And this changes everything. You can understand why Marxism arrives at this time, because you see the landscape changing. But it also changes technology. We have so many things that happen, and these impact the arts greatly. We have the arrival of photography, the impact of photography on the idea of what is an image and what makes an image. It just cannot be understated. We would not have had modernism or impressionism were it not for the impact of photography. Some things are pretty small that you never think about. One is the invention of manufactured paint in tubes. Prior to about the 1840s, if you wanted to paint outside and you wanted to carry your paint with you, you actually had to seal it up in a pig's bladder. That's what these things were. So people had to mix their own paints, pigments. These things were very expensive. But then eventually, metal tubes, which were used for medicines and other things, were used to make paints, and now paints were mass-produced. Colors, pigments, these things had to be handmade, and they were extraordinarily expensive at the beginning of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, anybody could go to an art store and buy them, just like we can. And this impacts the nature of art dramatically. One of the things that Renoir said is that without paint in tubes, there would have been no Cézanne and no Monet and no Impressionism. And he's absolutely right. That the wonderful Impressionist paintings we have happened because artists were able to carry their paints outside and to cheaply afford paints. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of these Impressionist paintings are suffering from this because the formulation of those paints was terrible. And we're now seeing this, that things that look white in some paintings, particularly some Van Gogh paintings, were meant to be red, but the color has completely faded because they hadn't really worked out fast colors yet. But you do have this revolution, and this means that paint and technology and training for art is far more accessible. And that means you're going to have a democratization of art. And of course, we've already talked a little bit about it, but it really can't be overstated that this time period, this 19th century, this rapid expansion of the industry and the economy of the West also comes at the time of the height of imperialism and colonialism, where we have just terrible subjugation of non-European peoples all over the world. But this too has a kind of interesting net impact, that it brings Europeans into contact with ideas that they had never even imagined before. African art and Asian art have a profound impact on the arts of the 19th century. And we start to see something remarkable, that we see that artists start to look to other cultures for their inspirations. We see the beginnings of an emergence of not a European art, but what will eventually become a global art. And by the time we hit the 21st century, even though we are still kind of living in the shadow of Western civilization, more and more we're seeing the integration of non-Western cultures into what it means to be global art. And then finally, the thing that really changes things is modernism. That by the beginning of the 20th century, we have a movement towards pure modernism, which is so reductionist that we get things like Bauhaus, where we strip out all the classical orders and we have a building that is made of glass and steel, that is honest to the materials that are inside of it. And then you have Kazimir Malevich, who's this suprematist painter, getting paintings and reducing them down to the simplest form. And how much more simple can you get than a black square? So modernism totally changes the aesthetic again. So what is the visual culture of Western art? A lot of what we're going to be talking about is the legacy of the Renaissance. So the first half of this class is the legacy of the Renaissance, how the Renaissance sets the tone for really the next 3 centuries of art. So from the 15th century up until the 19th century, the ideas of classicism, monumentality, those are going to dominate. It's going to have a lot of variation, believe me, a lot of variation. You're going to see a lot of strange things, mannerism, and etc. You're going to have a lot of variation in that, but still the Renaissance sets the standard for what art is and what it should be. But then the second half of the class is going to be the 19th century to the 21st century, and that's going to be a different story. And it's going to be the story of modernism, how modernism comes about. So, and this is actually 2 big stories. The first story is going to be the deconstruction of naturalism, the deconstruction of the classicism of the Renaissance and the Academy, where we move to more abstract forms such as Impressionism, and eventually to completely abstract forms such as Kazimir Malevich's Black Square. And then, because nothing can be ever deconstructed too much, we deconstruct it again. Because in the second half of the 20th century, everything goes bat guano crazy, and we abandon modernism. After having invented modernism and created this new thing, In the second half of the 20th century, people say, now we're going to go a different direction, and we're going to move away from the ideals of modernism into something else entirely. And that's where we're going to end up in the 20th century and the 21st century. So the 19th century is pretty much about the story of the deconstruction of classicism and the academy and the arrival of modernism, and its dominance in the first half of the 20th century. And the second half of the 20th century is the deconstruction of modernism. So kind of interesting. And as we move forward, we'll see that deconstruction will just continue. So that's what this class is about. It's essentially a survey of art, architecture, and visual culture of the Western world. But more importantly, we want you to see it from the social context. We want you to see it from the context of visual culture. How is our world shaped even today by the ideas of the Renaissance? And how do we respond to that? Some important points to consider. This is a history course. There's going to be a lot of concepts, terminologies, and vocabulary. Oh my gosh, there are so many isms. Impressionism, post-impressionism, Fauvism, Futurism, Cubism. There's an endless number of isms. You'll have to keep them all separate. And also historical methodology, and also social and religious and political context. Let's break some of these down. Art history doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the real world with real people, which means you do have to know about dates, periods, movements, names, etc., timelines, chronology. You'll have to know the difference between the centuries, the 15th, 16th, etc. Sometimes we call the 1400s the 1400s, sometimes we call them the 15th century, and sometimes, just because we want to be jerks, we call it the Quattrocento, because we want to be pretentious and use the Italian. There's certain events that have enormous impact on the arts, whether it's the French Revolution, the Salon des Refusés, or the Armory Show. The French Revolution was a time of incredible social upheaval, change in political class, and change in patronage. Art is fundamentally a feature of patronage, and if you have the church and the elites are patronizing art, and that ends, it's going to change art. Art ceases to be patronized by kind of the church and by nobles and aristocrats, and it starts to be patronized by the middle class. The Salon des Refusés is the classic example of that. It's this wonderful case where so many paintings got rejected from the Royal Salon, which was the royal show done by the French Academy every year, that they decided, okay, fine, we'll have a salon of the rejects. We'll have a show of all the rejects. But that allowed other artists to have a voice that they may not have had. Boy, did that change the world. The Armory Show, for example, is where modern art was first introduced to America, where European modernism was introduced to America, and it caused an enormous scandal, but it forever changed the needle on how art was going to go forward in America. Concepts, terminology, and vocabulary. Oh my gosh, there's so many isms, terms. There's stylistic terms, organic, abstract, realistic, idealistic, expressionistic, etc. And there's going to be a lot of overlap between these terms. So a work of art can be impressionist, but it may not be from the impressionistic period. So, impressionism is both a style that represents a kind of way that you paint, but it also represents a specific period in French painting. So make sure we don't confuse those. Also, we have to consider methodology. One of the big changes in art history in the 20th century is that we do concern ourselves very much with methodology. The way you look at art depends on, what you're looking at. And the way you look determines what you see. Formalism is just the old-fashioned way of concerning yourself with style and color and tone, etc. And that's kind of the bedrock of methodology. Excuse me. But it's not the only way to look at it. We can look at things from a feminist perspective. We can look at things from a Marxist perspective. How does a work of art represent class or struggles between groups in society? We can look at it from a Freudian perspective and see how things look. One of the examples that is very important, one of my favorites, is feminism. That whether an artist is a woman or not greatly impacts our perspective and our understanding of it. Artemisia Gentileschi, for example, very famous female artist. There weren't many famous female artists in the 17th century in the Italian Baroque, but she succeeded. But she has a very unique biography, and her biography impacts her art. Her art looks different than her peers because of her female perspective. And then likewise, by the time we get to the 20th century, we have artists making expressly feminist works of art, such as Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party that we'll take a look at. And then we just want you to recognize that art is not merely it's not just a reiteration of what they created, who made what, when, and where. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of that, but that's not really the goal. The goal is to give you a sense of what this culture is and how its art reveals that culture to you. This is very much what I like to do in art history. This is social art history. We can just, look at the mechanical nitty-gritty details of art, how it was painted and when and where. But at a certain point, that's just kind of dead to me. What I like is that art is a fossilized idea. It gives us a sense of these cultures, of how they were thinking, and of course, how we think today, because this is our culture. So many things we take for granted we don't realize. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of this lecture. We'll come back in part 2. In part 2, we'll describe the kind of nitty-gritty details of the course. This sets up the idea of the course, the major themes of the course, but we'll come back in part 2 and talk about, the textbook, the course requirements, etc. And we'll catch you and see you then.